Regardless of our experience level as a gardener, and regardless of where we garden, there are just some questions that we all seem to have. Join me today as I answer 10 of the most common questions that I've been asked. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and over the last year I've had a weekly live stream on YouTube, and I've answered hundreds and hundreds of questions. But there are some questions that just seem to be asked on a regular basis, regardless of the time of year, because gardeners are always wondering the same things. Until we do it and see it and develop that experience, we ask the question. The first question is whether you can save the seeds of the produce that you buy at the store and then plant those seeds. The simple answer to that question is yes. Yes, you can save the seed of what you buy at the supermarket, what you buy at a farmer's market, or what you harvest in your own garden. And you can plant those seeds. And you're likely to get a plant. But I think the question really should be, if I save the seed from the fruit at the supermarket and grow that plant, will I get the same fruit? And the answer to that question is probably not, because much of what we're buying in the market comes from big agriculture, and they're growing hybrid plants. They're growing plants that will produce the fruits and the vegetables that can be put in a box and put on a truck and then driven across the country and then stored in the open, and they'll last long and they'll look pretty. And that's one reason why they don't often taste as good as we would like them to taste, because they're being grown mainly for shipping and storing and presentation. And to get those attributes, they need to grow hybrid plants. Well, if you save the seed of a hybrid plant and then sow it and grow it in your garden, there's no guarantee of what the result will be. The fruit you buy, you like, but the plant you grow from that may be completely different. So, yes, you can save the seed and you can sow those seeds, but there's no guarantee that you're going to get the plant that you started with. Another common question is when and how much should I water my plants? The easy answer to this question is to water when your plants need water. It's as simple as that. The hard part is in determining when your plants need water. Now, I like to recommend the finger method, which is to physically put your finger into the soil to check the moisture level of your soil. For most plants, a consistently moist soil is what you're after. So if you stick your finger in and the soil is moist, then you don't need to water. And if you stick your finger in that bed and find out the soil is dry, then you do need to water. Too many of us get on a schedule where we water every morning or every evening, and some plants like that, but some plants don't need that much water, and other plants might need more water. So what we end up doing is underwatering and overwatering much of our garden, and those are the two most common problems. But you can get away from that by just checking the moisture level. You may find that based on your soil, you can get away with watering every 2 or 3 days. Or you may find if you're in a very low humidity region with very sandy soil, you might have to water twice a day. It varies based on your garden, your weather, your plants, and how you choose to water. Start by setting up a regular system, going out every morning and putting ½ an inch of water on your plants. And then the next day, come out and check the soil. If everything's fine, then come out the next day. Once you get into that pattern of checking the soil, you can figure out what the best schedule is for you and how much water to give your plants. Another very common question is, when is the best time to prune bushes and trees? This is another one of those answers where it depends on the plant. Now, generally speaking, late winter and early spring is the best time to prune most trees, shrubs, and bushes. by pruning when the plants are dormant. As soon as they wake up and a lot of the branches are gone, it will stimulate new growth, and you'll get some really good development on those plants that you prune during dormancy. But for spring flowering shrubs like azalea and forsythia and lilacs, you shouldn't prune during that dormant period, because those spring flowering plants are flowering on the previous year's growth. And if you're pruning during that dormancy, you're probably cutting off some of those flower buds that are going to develop and give you the flowers that you're after. So spring flowering plants, you should wait until after they flower to begin pruning. Most of the rest, you can do it during the dormant period. It's not advisable to prune during the summer months or in early fall, because the pruning stimulates new growth, and you really don't want some of that new young growth appearing during the heat of summer. It's going to damage the plant. But at any time that you see diseased or damaged branches on your plant, go ahead and cut those off. It's better for the plant to get rid of the bad material than to leave them in place and possibly cause further damage. The next question is, can I add organic materials like chicken poop and horse manure and eggshells and coffee grounds directly to the soil? The simple answer is yes, you can. But it may impact your plants depending on when you add those ingredients directly to the soil, because the materials like the chicken poop and the horse manure are adding nutrients to our soil after they've decomposed. There might be some immediate gain of ammonium, particularly for the chicken poop, and that can actually harm your plants by burning them. But when you put them directly into the soil, what we need to have happen is for the microbes in the soil to break down the organic material into forms that the plants can use. Nitrogen is a big component in that decomposition. So if you mix those kind of organic materials directly into your soil, it's going to take a lot of nitrogen to start breaking down that material into the nutrients that your plants can use. Well, at the same time, if you're growing plants, those plants need nutrients like nitrogen. But it's all tied up in the soil through that decomposition process. So we call it robbing nitrogen from the soil, because your plants need it, but the microbes are using it for decomposition. You can put these things directly into your soil, but I do not recommend that you plant soon afterwards. Allow time for the microbes to begin the decomposition. I'll add raw ingredients to my soil in the fall so that I have fall and winter and spring for that process to take place. And then when I plant in spring, I don't have as much worries about the nitrogen depletion within the soil. I think a better answer is to take all of that organic material and either create or add it to a compost pile. When you add the compost to your soil, the nutrients are available, the decomposition has already started or been completed, and it's much better for the soil. A very common question that I hear a lot is, when is the best time to fertilize my plants? First, I suggest that you grow out of that mindset that we're fertilizing our plants. Instead, we should focus on whether we need to add nutrients to our soil. And even on the Miracle Grow website, they acknowledge that when the soil is depleted, you should add fertilizer. So the simple answer to this question is, you should fertilize when your soil is depleted. And if you're regularly amending your soil, and if you have a healthy soil environment, you may never need to fertilize. But if you've done a soil test, if you've had analysis done to determine that your soil is deficient in particular nutrients, then the best time to fertilize is usually in the spring before the plants start growing. Because a lot like the organic material discussion we just had, many of the fertilizers need time to break down by the action of the microbes to be usable in a form that our plants can use, especially a lot of the organic and slow release fertilizers. They need time. So if you fertilize in early spring, your bed can be ready to go by the time the plants come in late spring. Or, like me, you can put a lot of organic material into the soil in fall. Give it all that time, and by the time you get to the spring planting, you might not need fertilizers at all. Many gardeners are taking their organic matter and trying to turn it into compost, but the process of compost can be confusing. And one of the most common questions I get is, what do I do with my compost pile during the winter? The answer to this depends on how you compost and what kind of winter weather you get. If you are practicing hot composting, where you keep a moist pile and you regularly turn it, you have a great mix of the greens and the browns, you can get temperatures between 140 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can maintain temperatures at that level even during the winter by covering it with a tarp to help hold in that moisture, and by getting outside in the cold weather to make sure the pile has enough oxygen and moisture and food for those microbes. But if you're practicing a system like I do with a cool composting, I don't get anywhere near those high temperatures. And my winters get so cold that it's not worth the effort to go out and try to turn the pile and get those ingredients right to raise the heat. Today, it's well below freezing in my garden, and over the weekend, it's going to get down to about minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Even with a cover, even with a lot of that activity to try to keep the pile hot, it's just too much work for me. So I let my pile freeze over the winter. All those microbes will go dormant, some of them will die, but as soon as things start warming up in the spring, my pile will kick into action and the decomposition will begin again. So, a lot of work covering the pile, maintaining the temperature is one way to make it through the winter, or just relaxing and let the natural process of microorganisms play out is another way. That's how I do it. Another good and very common question is, what are the best grow lights so I can start seeds indoors? And for this, my initial answer is, what lights do you have? Because they're probably good enough. For most of my gardening experience, I've used shop lights with fluorescent bulbs, the cheap ones that you buy to put over a workbench, and they worked great for me over many, many years. I have transitioned to LED lights, but they're still the cheap shop lights, and they do fine for how I am using my lights, because I only have seedlings under the lights for a few brief weeks before I'm putting them outside. I don't need to spend a lot of money on lights, and that's why I ask, what do you have? I don't think you need to spend a lot of money if all you're doing is germinating seeds, growing some seedlings, and then putting them outside. It's a completely different question if you're growing plants for profit or you're in some type of large-scale operation with plants growing year-round. Then you need to have some specialized lights, the blues and the reds and the purples. But for most of us, we don't need to go there. So I don't have a specific brand that I recommend. I don't have a particular type of light that I recommend. And if you've got a southern-facing window that gets more than 6 hours of direct sun a day, you may not need lights at all. So what is the best light to grow seeds? It's the one you can afford. It's the one that gives enough light for how many plants you're choosing to grow, and it's one that you're happy with. This next question may be a bit specialized, but the basic ideas and the answer I think are appropriate for all gardeners. And the question is, what is the best way to heat a greenhouse? The answer to this question correlates well with what we just talked about with the lights. You can spend a lot of money to put electric heaters in greenhouses or gas heaters in greenhouses, but I think the best way to heat a greenhouse is by using the sun's energy. Most of us can't afford all the fancy heaters. All we have is the sun. And the way that most greenhouses work is they have at least one open side where the sun can shine through and heat up the greenhouse. I think the question should have an extra part to it, which is, what's the best way to heat a greenhouse so it stays warm at night and in winter. And this is where you can use some of these nice little gardening tricks some of us have learned over the years. Water is a great way to heat your greenhouse. During the day, the sun will warm the water, and then at night and during the cold days of winter, that water will release that heat and help keep the air in the greenhouse warm. At the Galileo School Garden, we had a massive water tank, and that was the way we kept our greenhouse warm, particularly during the winter months. It never got below 20 degrees in that unheated greenhouse because of the water. Another great way to retain that heat is by using stone or brick as another method. It will heat up during the day and then radiate that heat during the cold times of winter or night. And so in the big greenhouse I had a gravel floor so that the gravel could absorb some of that heat. And you could use brick walkways or brick walls to accomplish the same thing. So use the sun to heat it initially, but then use methods like stone and water to help retain the heat. Around our plants, you can do the same thing. If you don't have a greenhouse, but you're using plastic over hoops, you can put rocks and gallon jugs of water in that bed overnight, and that'll help keep your plants a little bit extra warmer. Another common question that all of us ask at some point in our gardening journey is, when should I start seeds indoors? The answer to this question is dependent on additional information, but it's information you should know in your garden, and that's what your last frost date is. Because when you look at a seed packet, it should tell you whether you can start indoors, and if you can, it will reference your last frost date. Tomatoes, for instance, on a seed packet, it'll say start indoors 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. Well, if you don't know your last frost date, then you have no idea of when to start. But by knowing that date, all you have to do is look on a calendar and count backwards 6 to 8 weeks, and that's when you should start your tomato seeds. And that holds true with all of the other plants that you're going to be starting from seed. Use a calendar as a reference for the last frost date and for the point that you decide to start your seeds. Many gardeners have some variation on this next common question, and that's, how do I keep moles or voles or gophers or deer or any type of animal out of my garden? The simple answer is that you should have a barrier. A barrier is the best way to keep animals away from your plants. And that barrier can take many forms. A fence is often the simplest thing that we can put around our garden to keep a lot of those animals out. But for burrowing animals, we have to anticipate that they're probably going to be burrowing from underneath our beds. All of my beds have hardware cloth or poultry wire underneath it because I have a vole and gopher problem, in addition to rabbits. So to keep those burrowing animals out of my beds, I put a barrier at the bottom of that bed. When they encounter that barrier, they can't crawl up to my plants. The same with deer. You can put some type of wire or mesh or netting or a fence as a barrier to keep deer out of your garden. If you have a problem with birds, well then bird netting over your plants is one of the best ways to do it. You can try to use some of those chemical concoctions, but pretty much with anything you're going to spray or douse on the ground, it will dissipate over time. So you're going to have to reapply it on a regular basis. And that's if the animals don't get used to the aroma, the smell, because those are typically what keeps the animals away. So if you're spraying something that stinks really bad in your garden, eventually the deer are going to get used to it and it's not going to keep them away. Use a barrier, and that's how you keep these pests out of your garden. No doubt you've asked some of these questions, as have many other gardeners, and I've packed a lot of information in this video. If you've benefited from this information, I suggest you share this video with a gardening friend who can benefit as well. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.